and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Caroline Kline, co-editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Today, I am joined by Kate Davis, author of the article Heavenly Bodies, Mormon Male Homoerotics in the Sacred Art of Arnold Friberg, which appears in the spring 2026 issue of Dialogue. Kate is an interdisciplinary scholar of religion and gender whose work explores how bodies, identity, and belief are shaped through culture and representation. In this article, she offers a fascinating rereading of the iconic Book of Mormon artwork of Arnold Friberg, arguing that these familiar images don't just depict scripture, but actively construct a particular vision of Mormon masculinity that is at once hypermasculine, aspirational, and perhaps surprisingly homoerotic. We'll be talking about this sacred art of Arnold Friberg. We'll talk about muscular Christianity, gender construction, and what it means to queer even the most familiar visual traditions in Latter-day Saint culture. Kate, welcome. We are so glad that you are able to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk about these really tremendous paintings. It's very exciting.
It is. And your paper is fun too. And so I absolutely recommend it to our listeners. So let's start from the beginning. Your article opens with a vivid description of Friberg's painting, Ammon Defends the Flocks, which draws attention to the physicality of the male body. What first led you to see these familiar images as not just devotional, but also deeply invested in constructing a particular kind of masculinity?
So I think this is one of those places where being a Mormon studies scholar who didn't grow up associated with the tradition is really apparent, because I didn't grow up with these pictures. I, didn't grow up knowing who Ammon was, who Moroni was. Like, these are all new. And so for the first time, when I see these images of these incredibly brawny, large, hairless and glistening men, to me, those have a different association. I grew up in a Protestant denomination where, there were pictures of Jesus and the apostles, those things, but all of these figures are really new to me. And so I'm sure, had I grown up seeing them in devotionals, in Book of Mormon illustrated editions, I would have a different relationship with them. But as an outsider, I was really struck by just how large and I will say homoerotic these images are. As soon as I saw them, I knew I was going to write about this. I've been joking about it on social media for a while, and then was like, nope, it's time. We're writing this paper.
Yeah, and it's fantastic. And I think you're right that the fact that you grew up outside the tradition means that these were not normalized images for you like they were for me. Like it wouldn't necessarily, well, I would recognize the buffness of these people. It didn't really strike me as so just, I don't know, so different, from other types of depictions of masculinity. So now you argue in your paper that Friberg's work participates in a broader mid-century cultural moment shaped by muscular Christianity, and anxieties about the quote unquote sissification of men. And so, how did those wider American concerns about masculinity intersect with Mormonism's own post-polygamy identity crisis?
So it's a really interesting question. I think you see a real confluence of the Americanness of Mormonism in this moment, because there, in broader American society, there is at least perceived to be a sort of masculinity crisis around the turn of the 20th century, where you have this rapid rise in industrialization, people are moving to cities, you sort of get the loss of this idealized, lone cowboy out standing in front of a sunset, this very hyper masculine ideal as people are moving into cities and taking these industrial jobs. And we're starting to get some anxiety as a culture about the loss of the American frontier, what that means. And so a lot of artists are starting to depict different versions of masculinity. We see this with Norman Rockwell. We see this with Arnold Friberg. Like all of these different artists are tapping into that anxiety. And so in Christianity, more broadly in America, we're also seeing a decline in male attendance at church. And this is not an anxiety that has gone away. We can see this through the 20th and 21st centuries. The entire, Wild at Heart, John Eldridge movement is also tapping into this anxiety that in some way Jesus and Christianity has been sissified.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mormonism is going through a similar anxiety process, but Mormon masculinity had been so defined in popular imagination, and I think in the imagination of members, by plural marriage. And so in a post-manifesto world, how can men define themselves if they have been defined as patriarchs, as providers, as, peculiar, right? They have taken so much pride in being outsiders that when Utah becomes a state, when they start to get more political representation, as they're taking steps towards integration into broader society, they're starting to feel this same anxiety about masculinity that other Christian denominations are also feeling. And so what I think we see is a turn towards hyper-masculinized representation. It's like instead of being this patriarch of a large plural family, the ideal Mormon man has to be, incredibly hardy and hale and athletic and brawny and logical and kind and all of these sort of American quote unquote male ideals that I think we still see in Mormonism as ideals of masculinity. The idea of like a rough and tumble boy in the Boy Scouts who then, goes on to be an honorable Eagle Scout, who then goes on to become a leader in his community and a bishop, and like this progression, we're starting to see that become masculine identity in the early part of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the Boy Scouts because certainly as Mormon men were shedding their identities as polygamists, like yeah, one way they were reconstructing was finding new ways towards masculinity, and one was the Boy Scouts, which did have that, like you just said, that hearty, hale, outdoorsman, strong kind of vibe to it. So it's actually not surprising at all that the church would start to affiliate with the Boy Scouts in that early 20th century. Um, One of your central claims is that Friberg's art is not just reflective, but is actually generative, that it actually helps produce Mormon ideas about gender. And can you explain what it means to say that sacred art inscribes gender onto the body?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was researching Friberg, I found that he also was saying a similar thing. Like he really believed that his art was generative, that he was creating images that would in some way shape and define masculinity for the church. So in this way, we got to dip into some feminist theory a little bit and talk about bodies. So do bodies just exist in the world, ahistorical? Are bodies constantly being redefined by cultural norms and inscriptions? Or do they just exist on their own without that input? And so in this paper, but more generally, I do use Anne Fastrow-Sterling and Elizabeth Grosz, who are two theorists who talk about bodies as being created through cultural dialogue and inscription. So when Friberg paints, a hairless, large, shining man, he's really creating a sort of blueprint for masculinity. And then that filters down through populations. So, in the way that we define ourselves against an other, we're also looking for those cues as to what we should be and how we understand our own identity in our own bodies. When I'm explaining some of this to students, I often draw a stick figure on the board and I say, this is our norm, this is our standard. The further you deviate from that norm, the less legible or recognizable you are in society. So who gets to define that norm? That norm is not ahistorical. That norm doesn't just exist. So the person who gets to decide what the norm is has a lot of power. And I think what we see in Friberg's art and in the art of a lot of these early 20th century artists, writers and artists, is trying to gain control of that norm. To say this is what masculinity is, and deviation from this norm is deviant, quite literally. And then we see that filtered through how we understand our own bodies, whether that's through weight training or, current obsessions with getting enough protein in that grind set, right? Like we conform our bodies to those cultural inscriptions in order to be legible within our communities. So Friberg is really defining what it is okay to be as a Mormon man. And the less you resemble that, the less you are sort of coded as human in society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk about that there's like an aspirational element here, right? As men look at these paintings of these incredibly ripped scriptural heroes, there's this quest for to be like them. And in fact, my next question is kind of about this. You draw in this article on Eve Sedgwick's work to distinguish between sexuality and what you call homoerotic or homophilic desire, especially the idea of wanting to be like rather than wanting to possess. So, how does that framework help us see Friberg's paintings differently?
Yeah, I think we only think of homoeroticism or eroticism as purely sexual, and I don't think it has to be. And this has been a movement in particularly queer theory to think more broadly about this. Friberg's art is so clearly from and for the male gaze. Um, he is producing men that other men want. Like this is his impetus, right? And so he is purposefully creating desire in the viewer. And that desire doesn't have to be sexual desire for the object. It could be desire to be like rather than to have. So it's a sort of homo desire because it is male to male in this instance, right? It is a same-sex desire, but homophilic because it is admiration and love and adoration for the male form and for these masculine ideals that Friberg says he is painting into his characters. He's painting, as he put it, like from the inside out. He's imagining, the type of person who could do what Aemon does and then making that image. So he's manifesting inward greatness outward on the body. And in doing so, he is asking us to admire these figures.
Mm-hmm.
But women are very absent from this. Like, these are male aspirational images, much more so than they are for any female gaze. And so homophilic desire, again, doesn't have to be sexual desire for sexual intercourse with the desired thing. It can be this aspirational desire, this admiration and love for masculinity and the male form that is not homosexual, but is homoerotic.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that kind of touches on my next question as well, which is this. You in your paper, you do this striking comparison between Friberg's art and the art of Tom of Finland. And on the surface, these two artists and their works seem worlds apart. Like, one is obviously quite, religious in theme. One is explicitly sexual. But you show that they do share similar visual codes. And so, what does that comparison of Tom of Finland and Friberg, what does that comparison reveal about the relationship between hypermasculinity and homoeroticism?
Yeah. This is one of those points where I was like, am I going to get in trouble for making this comparison? Tom of Finland was a mid-century artist who painted homosexual scenes that were printed in sort of pulp magazines. They are often feature, sailors or other roustabout type figures in hypersexualized positions. We're talking, really over exaggerated bulges and men sort of giving each other the eye. Like, these are very sexual images. But body type wise and often body positioning is not that different from Friberg. Like, if you look at some of Tom of Finland's work and then compare it with Moroni addressing his troops, there's a lot of similarity in body positioning, in the way that the viewer is asked to consume the body of the body being depicted. And so I think they're sort of doing similar things, and that's not always conscious, and it's not always benign either. I think there's valid criticism for both Friberg and Tom of Finland that the men that they depict are still very normative. They are very white. They are very able-bodied. They are coded in a way that is very almost heteronormative in their appeal. Again, we're getting away from this sort of sissification to hypermasculine. And within each, there's sort of an emphasis on militaristic bodies, and Tom of Finland often paints cops in ways that really support a sort of police on perpetrator relationship that, can be problematic.
Mm.
So even though they are both in some ways outsiders in society, they are creating these bodies which are so idealized for American norms, or Western norms more generally for Tom of Finland. So yes, Friberg is not painting bulges in the same way, like his men, not always more clothed, I will say. They are often not very clothed, but there's sort of an open desire that we are invited to partake in for both of these types of images of outsider communities that are trying to embody this normative ideal.
So interesting. And you did mention this a few minutes ago, but I'm going to return to it. In your paper, you point out that women are largely absent, or you were talking about how women are not assumed to be part of that gaze that's looking at Friberg, but they're also quite absent, you talk
Yeah.
about in your paper. They're visually minimized in Friberg's work. What does that absence of women tell us about how masculinity and even spirituality is being defined in these images?
Yeah, I think here this really ties into the muscular Mormonism, muscular Christianity movement, which is about reasserting male dominance in the church, bringing men back into religious spaces. And in assuming a male audience, we are quite literally sidelining women because part of this concern about sissification is that the church has become too feminine. Women are in too many positions of authority, women are too prominent. We're losing that sort of masculine energy or male headship. All of these things are under threat. And so, what we see in Friberg's art is really an emphasis on not just these sort of tightness men, but male companionship, male friendship, and even male strife. Ammon defending his flocks is defending it against a male attacker. But if we look more broadly at the literature of the time, we're also seeing this emphasis on male friendship. George Buchanan's um, biography of Joseph Smith really sidelines all of the women in Joseph's life and focuses on his male relationships as almost the key relationships. So, all of his wives, all of the women, his mother are really sidelined. And we have to portray him as, ready to wrestle any of his male friends at any moment. But those male friendships and companionship become the center of his day-to-day life because women are not able in this imagination to aspire to that level of companionship, right? If we're defining maleness and masculinity as logical and strong and brave and all of these things, we're doing that against an other. And femininity as the other is the lack of all of those things. So if the church has been sissified, the way to get through that is to bring back this masculine energy. And there really isn't a place for traditional femininity in those spaces.
Interesting. Yeah, or if they are there, they're kind of just off in the background, like they're just not the focus. They are just not the
Mhm.
focus, which we absolutely see in so much of Friberg's art. Absolutely. Toward the end of the article, you raise a very provocative question, which is if Mormon theology insists that gender is eternal and essential, why does it seem so fragile, so in need of constant reinforcement? And of course, this is a question that Taylor Petrie
Mhm.
raises in a lot of his work. So my question to you is, yeah, why does it seem so fragile, despite the way it's depicted as, eternal and essential? And also, how does Friberg's art help us to see that tension more clearly?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot, and Taylor's work is really great for this topic. If this masculinity is so, or femininity are so inherent to our identity, right? If we are gendered from birth continually through life, how can we have a masculinity crisis? How can we have this sort of threat to something that is so fundamental? if we truly believed, boys will be boys and girls will be girls, snips and snails, puppy dog tails, whatever it is we're saying, right? We wouldn't constantly have to reaffirm and provide these boundaries and reinscriptions of gendered identity. The fact that there is so much cultural anxiety around particularly masculinity shows us that it maybe isn't as stable of an identity as some people might want to present, that it is perhaps something that can be redefined, resignified, reinscribed, and is not as steady or innate as we might think it is. I think it's Judith Butler who says, if gender is performance, we can perform it differently. And so the idea that all of these artists and thinkers and, people writing self-help books are so worried about the collapse of masculinity, perhaps we should think about that as a shifting locus of identity rather than something that is so concrete and fixed. And in Friberg's art, he's very aware of that tension. I was always finding quotes from him as I was researching about how he really, it's like, I need to show what masculinity is, and then it will become like this. Like, okay, is it like that, or will it become like that? Which of those things is true? If it just is like that, you don't need these signposts.
Right.
So
Right.
clearly we are signifying something.
Yeah, like exactly right. If these things are so eternal, before life, after life, during life, if you are like absolutely, concretely within this one sex or gender, why do we have to teach men how to be men, and why do we have to teach women how to be women? Because yeah, so exactly what you're saying. There is this kind of irony or contradiction or something that's going on there. Yeah, I love it. Um, Last question. So, you suggest that these hyper masculine, idealized bodies might actually unintentionally open up space for queering Mormon masculinity. And so I wanted to ask you what you mean by that, and what possibilities do you see for reinterpreting these images in more expansive or liberating ways?
Yeah, I mean, queering in this context means moving away from normative ideals and looking to the margins for other ways of being, other ways of knowing one's body, of existing in one's body and one's identity. And so if Friberg is showing one perspective of what Mormon masculinity is and pushing towards that ideal, again, if we can think of this as shifting rather than concrete, I think it leaves room for other interpretations of masculinity. That there are stories in the Book of Mormon, stories in the Bible, which are interpretable in alternative ways. That this is not the only form of masculinity. So to queer this would be to look outside of this sort of giant titan man and see, are there other understandings of masculinity? If we're already admitting we have to reaffirm this, we have to guidepost and signpost what masculinity is, can we do it differently? And in these images, despite not being his intention, I do believe that they are homoerotic, that they have a lot of this homophilic potential. And so reinterpreting these giant men as objects of desire can also be really interesting for understanding masculinity in a religious context. Like, these were not, and queering that, these were not intended to be objects of queer desire, but they very much, I believe, are and can be. So how do we reinterpret and re-understand these images through that sort of queered lens?
Hmm. Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. Kate, thank you so much for joining us for today and just for this really interesting article. This is an article I've been excited about from day one. So thank you. Thanks for your work here and on that article that we are so excited to have published.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Good for me as well. To our listeners, you can read Kate Davis's article, Heavenly Bodies, Mormon Male Homoerotics and the Sacred Art of Arnold Friberg, in the spring 2026 issue of Dialogue. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends or colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or reach out with your comments and questions. Be sure to subscribe to this show and explore the other great podcasts in the Dialogue Podcast Network. This has been Caroline Kline. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Greetings. My name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.